Hello and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Syria and the spiral of violence. Why does the West refuse to describe events being played out in Syria as a civil war? Why is there such resistance to finding a political settlement among the warring factions? And will outside intervention eventually tear Syria apart? To crosstalk the situation unfolding in Syria, I'm joined by WerthMuller in Washington. He's a research fellow at the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. In London, we have Patrick Hayes. He's a journalist and political commentator. And in Cairo, we go to Rami Jarrah. He is a political activist and co-founder of Activist News Association. All right, gentlemen, this is CrossTalk. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Patrick, I'd like to go to you first in London. There seems to be this amazing lack of recognition that really what's happening in Syria is a civil war, and I'm looking at Western capitals right now. But when I think about what's going on there and I see the pictures, there are two concepts, two words that come to my mind. One is militarization, and the other one is Lebanization. And of course, I'm referring to the civil war that played out in Lebanon for such a long time that was so horrific for that small country. I mean, it is a civil war, and we have such a good example, historical example. You don't have to look at Libya. Look at Lebanon, and you have a reasonably good fit.
I agree that I think it should be seen in that kind of way as a civil war. I also think, you know, it's a civil war with a slight difference, though, because it is very difficult to establish exactly who the opposition is in Syria and exactly how kind of coherent that is. And I do think that in terms of the struggle against Assad, that is one of the problems. You have quite a splintered, kind of chaotic situation in Syria, more so than you did in the Arab Spring last year in, say, Egypt or Tunisia. There's less of a sense of a coherent opposition. So I can understand why it's a bit hard to define it in very clear-cut terms. But at the same time, I think, you know, the West's refusal to see it in these kind of terms and to see it almost in a very polarised way, where you have Assad, who's effectively now, who was, you know, a couple of years ago seen as a reformer and was actually kind of welcomed, and you know, the West very much saw themselves as being able to work with him. Now have kind of really polarised the situation and see him as a kind of ogre-like figure, similar to the way in which Gaddafi was portrayed, who is effectively just trampling on the Syrian people. And I think that polarisation won't benefit anyone, especially should it mean Western intervention into the situation.
Okay, Kurt, if I can go to you. I mean, we had Assad come out saying he wants to have a referendum on the 27th of this, I'm sorry, 26th of this month, and it was scoffed at very much by Western capitals. Again, I mean, why is there such resistance to at least try a negotiated settlement to this conflict? Because if there is no settlement, the deaths continue. People continue to die. And, you know, if you choose a side in a civil war, which effectively is what the West has already done, you still have more deaths. I mean, it's the worst of all possible worlds right now.
I think it is unfair to draw a real clear parallel between Gaddafi, of course, and Bashar al-Assad for one particular reason, and that is between Assad, there's also a fairly comprehensive regime. It's not quite the same personification of the state that Gaddafi was, of course. There is, of course, the significant cult of personality that's surrounded the Syrian regime long before Bashar al-Assad came to power, of course. And so when we're talking here about the Syrian government, we're not just talking about Bashar al-Assad, we're also talking about the entire Ba'athi regime that's backing him up with all of their supporters and a pretty significant state apparatus. And that's something that really needs to come into play here. We're not just talking about a single individual who pulls all the strings of the state. Having said that, I think it's fairly clear that there is simply too much water under the bridge at this point. There have been too many deaths. There's been too much bloodshed and a tremendous amount of polarization between opposition figures, not necessarily in terms of just the leaders, but in terms of the people who have been coming out to protest, putting their lives on the line. and between them and this state that's been perpetrating these acts.
Well, I mean, Kurt, if I can go to Rami
yes.
in Cairo, I mean, again, I'm very hesitant to make this a binary here. I mean, they're the protesters, quote unquote protesters, and some of them are pretty heavily armed now, and they're killing a lot of people. I mean, there are even reports, because not much is coming out of Syria that we can rely upon, of beheadings. Okay, I mean, there's a radicalization on the protester side. And, I mean, these people are not, Solzhenitsyn with a Kalashnikov, okay? I mean, this is getting much more serious. That's why I started out the program by calling it a civil war. I mean, there's violence being committed by at least two sides, and I would say all sides. What do you think about that?
I'll definitely answer to that, but if I could first go back to Patrick saying, with what he said, that there is one point to keep in mind. Syria is no exception from the Arab Spring, from any other country that's taking part in the Arab Spring. These are revolutions, and Syria is not an exception. The only thing that makes it an exception is the excessive use of violence by the Syrian regime and the fact that the Syrian government has managed to continue killing its own people without anyone stepping in or able to protect these civilians. The Syrian people have tried themselves. The international community has also tried but failed to do anything in that case. In terms of Syria now facing a civil war, this is definitely over-exaggerated. This isn't almost as far as being claimed. But what we're seeing in Syria is the government basically placing this propaganda that there is a civil war coming in Syria, that it's already begun, and that there's sectarian strife. The only party that actually introduced sectarian strife at the very beginning of the Syrian revolution was the Syrian government. This was the only way that the government could get out of this situation that they were in, this mess that they were in, where people were going to the streets and simply calling for democracy and for regime change. The government had to cover that up. The only way they could cover that up is scare the minorities with claims that there was an attack.
If I could interject here, I mean, if you can want to put it's water under a bridge, okay, fine. But now all sides are committing acts of violence, okay? You want to say who started it, okay, that's fine, okay? But any state in the world is going to strike back at people that have arms, okay? And I'm not justifying the regime in Syria, but what I'm saying is that all sides are using violence right now, and that's why I'll go back to I'll keep hammering away at my point of why shouldn't the international community be pushing for negotiations on the ground instead of having Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and all these other countries, Turkey, the United States, and who knows what Israel's role in all of this right now. I mean, shouldn't we be focused on the folks on the ground first before this spreads through the entire region?
I'm sorry, but I wouldn't agree on the fact that there was violence being portrayed from both sides. That's not the case. We have one side that's attacking its own people in peaceful demonstrations, and another side which is formed of defected soldiers and maybe some recruited civilians who wish to protect these civilians. These are defected soldiers. They don't have artillery, or they have weapons, AK-47s at the max, maybe an RPG, but not tanks, not gunships,
well, okay,
not helicopters.
If I go to Patrick in London, that may change. That may change. Patrick, go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to say I don't actually see what the problem is with the Syrian people taking up arms against Assad. I do agree with Rami that, in some ways you can see this as a continuation of the Arab Spring. I think there's a slight difference in terms of the coherence of the opposition, but when Assad is cracking down on particular areas in a very kind of brutal way, it is difficult for people to cohere and debate and, for example, go to a kind of Tahrir Square-like situation that you saw in Egypt. But I mean, sometimes in these situations, as we saw in Libya, people do need to take up arms against the state and to overthrow it. I would defend that. I don't think this necessarily can be resolved peacefully, and attempts to negotiate could also put it on ice and could put that struggle for freedom and democracy in Syria, which is going on, on hold. Where I think it is problematic, though, is where you have external forces effectively portraying the Syrian people as vulnerable, as kind of like helpless in the situation and unable to battle against Assad for themselves. And I think, it's very clear in my mind that the only way in which history can be made here, the only way in which true democracy can be brought about and genuine leadership and a coherent sense of ideas for how to take the country forwards can really be established is through the Syrian people doing this for themselves rather than having Western intervention, which effectively is is trying to deliver democracy to that region. It doesn't work like that. It hasn't worked in Syria.
It hasn't worked in other
countries where that's taken place.
It may be contributing to the violence, because if I go back to Kurt in Washington, you may have elements within Syria that are hoping for a Western intervention, and that's stopping them from negotiating. And Assad, I mean, you could look at it from a different point of view. If there's going to be an intervention, he's going to do as much as he possibly can now to make sure there's nothing to intervene about. So, I mean, this prospect of outside intervention makes the situation even worse in the country.
You know, I think one of the difficulties, not just in our conversation, but in the broader conversation about Syria, is the definition of what we mean by intervention. Mm-hmm. And one of my concerns at the moment, and I should say fairly clearly, I do believe that I won't just say the West, but the outside world, I think, should be involved somehow. I think there is some violence going on, perhaps on both sides, but it's clearly not a parallel situation. You know, the Free Syrian Army, which is an entirely uncoordinated organization, if we can even use that term, by no means represents the same kind of power as the Syrian state. I don't think we can look at those in a completely parallel fashion. But at the same time, I think it's very clear that the state, which has a responsibility to its people to protect, not to oppress, has been using a far greater degree of violence against people, some of whom are armed, many of whom are not, than has, if we can use this term, the other side. So I do believe that we should intervene, but I'm not talking about boots on the ground. I'm not saying we should all go gung-ho dropping bombs on the Syrian army at the moment. I think we can be much more imaginative in terms of how we talk about intervention. In a way that does justice in terms of
Libya.
I mean,
Libya wasn't supposed to happen, but Libya happened, okay? All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, okay? And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with our team. Okay, I'd like to go back to Rami in Cairo. I started out the program saying how disappointed I am, but expected that the Western powers wouldn't like to call what's going on in Syria a civil war, because it has very important political and geopolitical implications. But let's talk about another thing that Western media and politicians don't like to talk about, and it's the sectarian strife there. I mean, this is about sectarian. You said it in the first part of the program about defectors. Most of them, at least I've been told, are Sunni. What does that tell you?
Well, that's not actually the case, but the majority of the country is Sunnis, so you would see a majority of defectors being Sunnis. We've seen Alawites, we've seen Christian defectors. That's actually not the case. But what you have in Syria now is the government basically portraying that there's sectarian violence, and that's sort of provoking both sides. What you're seeing is in the army, I have to be detailed about this, in the army, with mobile phones, only the Alawites are allowed to carry those mobile phones, and only they are allowed to film themselves basically undertaking atrocities against civilians. We've seen these videos of soldiers beating civilians, and they're mainly Alawites. It's not because only the Alawites are taking part in this crackdown. Actually, every element of the country that are taking part in the security, with the security forces, are taking part, all the different sectors. But this basically points to the viewers that Alawites are doing this. And then when you're in an area like Homs in Bab Amr, and you've been under siege for 12 or so days, and without bread, water, electricity, or any source of communication, then that does tend to frustrate people. Now, I'm not saying that that means that what you're going to see is sectarian violence. Again, the government is over-exaggerating the sectarian violence. What we're seeing is in the army, because people are not able to defect, they reach a point where they refuse to open fire at civilians, and they will be executed by the regime. These people, these same soldiers that are executed, are then lifted in funeral processions by the regime, claiming that terrorist elements, Sunni terrorist elements, killed them. If they were Alawites, that would probably be the scenario, and that would cause a conflict. The longer the Syrian regime is in power,
but if you're going to do it by mathematics, then most of the victims are Sunni, because the regime is not. Okay, at least the leadership is. Patrick, if I can go to you, the sectarian difference is something that is downplayed a lot in Western media, and that helps downplay the role that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other countries, great democracies, by the way, in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, the role that they're playing there. And again, again, it seems to me it's a domino thing. It's all about Iran. It has nothing to do about democracy. It has nothing to do about civil liberties. It has nothing to do about human rights. It has nothing to do with the Syrian people. It's just it's leverage to go after Hezbollah, to go after Iran. And that's why, we have Al-Qaeda and the United States on the same side in Syria. Amazing geopolitics.
I think just on the sectarianism aspect, I think that tends to get played up in the absence of politics. I don't think there's any fundamental political divides between a lot of these different kind of sectarian groups. I think ultimately it does speak to a certain lack of coherence and a certain lack of shared ideas or a sense of really what they're trying to come together and achieve. So I mean, I think sectarianism can be overplayed a lot. I think interestingly, there's a lot of scaremongering at the moment about the Al-Qaeda elements in Syria and the Free Syrian Army.
I would agree.
Both from Assad and also kind of from the West as well. I mean, they're getting nervous about it as well. So, but I think actually that does tend to be scaremongering. These things can be overplayed.
Okay, Patrick,
so
let me stay with you. Let me stay with you. I mean, if you're saying it's scaremongering, this is internationalizing it, okay? And this, again, is what we heard, Assad must go. Because when the United States says, when Britain says, when France says, somebody has to go, they have to go, don't they? And internationalizing it, bringing in the Al-Qaeda element, helps make that happen.
Well, yes, of course. I think that's true, and I think we saw with the UN Security Council, China and Russia vetoed the resolution, and now it seems like it's going to go to the General Assembly again. It seems like they're going to try and have other condemnations of Assad. Britain and France are talking about working together to find ways of helping the Free Syrian Army. They're just trying to boycott the process because it didn't work for them. It's the same that you see with a lot of kind of global elites when they don't get their own way, they just try and find alternative ways to meddle. This has been happening for quite a long time in Syria. You must remember the Arab League, which is not hardly made up of great kind of democratic countries themselves. I mean, you have Bahrain, which at the moment is cracking down on hospitals for injured protesters. It's just completely ignored by the West. I mean, I feel very sorry for the Bahraini people because they have suffered some hideous crackdowns over the past year, and that is just ignored because it's not in their interest to bring that to the fore. I have to say, one of the other aspects that you really see here are other kind of external agents kind of brought in, like the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is brought into Syria, which no one thinks realistically has nuclear weapons, but it's brought in a way to get people on the ground and to meddle and put the pressure on and to meddle in a sovereign country's affairs. Now, that's not something America would ever tolerate. America would never tolerate another country going in and saying, we want to crack down on the fact you have the death penalty. There's no respect for national sovereignty in this region at all.
Okay.
And I think to that extent, it reeks for kind of neo-colonialism, where the West is basically saying these countries are unable to govern their own people. We need to come in and teach them how to do democracy. I think it's very problematic.
Let me go to Kurt now. Well, I tend to agree with you, Patrick, because the more there is this creeping interventions into Syria. I mean, we know that from Lebanon there are arms going into Syria right now. That's been established, okay? And this is another mission creep here. I mean, once this whole process of regime change, and that's the ultimate goal right here, it's just it won't go through the United Nations. There'll be a coalition of the willing, and then Western powers and their friends in the Chattering League, or the Arab League as it's officially known, will support that.
The term neocolonialism, I will say, and I'll pretty directly admit, one of the worst parts, of course, with the United States' involvement in Iraq was, well, there are lots of problems that we could talk about, of course, but one of the most important problems was that it delegitimized for the near future the idea of intervening even when it's appropriate. I don't even want to use the term regime change because of the sort of baggage that carries along, but I don't think because there was those sorts of strategic ideological concerns with Iraq that it needs to be necessarily made that that's what the United States and other countries are talking about now. I don't think talking about intervention here in the Syrian context needs to be the same sort of conversation. I don't think it necessarily is neocolonialism that we're talking about. But having said that, I think we can use the Iraq context to bring up a really important point here, which is, of course, one of the big problems with that in the very recent history was fairly poor planning in terms of what happens after the fall of a regime. One of my big concerns right now with Syria, as much as I want to see some kind of involvement, I think there's a real obsession with the fall of Assad. How do we bring down Assad? How do we make this regime fall? How do we do this? But there's not a whole lot of conversation about what comes after. And Peter, you mentioned the sectarian question earlier. I think this is a real concern for Syrian society. Whether Bashar al-Assad's regime comes down because of intervention, or if it comes down at all, and if it comes down just in terms of a civil war, we do have to be prepared for what's going to come afterward. And I don't think the world is discussing that very much. What's going to happen when with the very real possibility of sectarian violence erupting between, of course, the Sunni majority, the alot minority.
I think everybody knows the word Fallujah. Everyone knows Fallujah,
that will be stuck in the middle.
Okay, Rami, if I can go to you. What's happening here? How is Syria evolving? And what are the new political realities that are possible? Let's say, parenthetically, there is a regime change, and it's either externally or internally. What kind of Syria is going to be left behind? Will it be very much divided? Will it be partitioned? Will you see outside powers? And I'm thinking of Iran, I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia. Are they going to scramble for some kind of more influence if there's a real fluid situation?
Well, can I first just work on what Kirk actually said? Syria, at the beginning of this revolution, people were not calling for regime change. They were calling for reform. What they got in reply were security forces opening fire at civilians, detaining them, torturing them, some to death. That's actually what happened. It took about a month and 10 days until the ceiling of demands were raised to what is now the toppling of the Assad regime. The Assad regime has continued to deny that they do this. The Syrian ambassador to the UN claims that they're actually protecting these demonstrations. Russia itself has called on the Syrian regime to refrain from excessive use of force. So, I mean, all parties here agree that the Syrian regime is using excessive use of force, is killing its own civilians. I don't understand why we're talking about what an intervention would then affect on Syria, what that would have, what after effect that would have. If the situation continues the way it's going on now, it's going to become much worse, and then the likely possibility of an intervention at that stage would be a catastrophe. But what we're asking for now is some solution for some sort of protection for these civilians. We've seen a failure of that from the international community. We've seen a failure in politics because countries like Russia or China are supporting the Syrian regime, I think Russia in particular. And we've seen collision of statements between Russia and between Syria, and don't understand why Russia continues to support Syria.
Well, it's very obvious. It's called Libya. It's called Libya in respecting sovereignty. Kurt, you wanted to jump in there. Go ahead.
Yes, I do. You know, Rami makes a good point that things are really bad right now. There's a lot of violence going on. And I want to make it clear, I don't think concern for what might happen after the regime should necessarily be a reason to say we're going to wash our hands of the whole affair. But what I do think needs to happen is a realistic assessment saying, okay, if the regime falls, can it be worse than what's going on right now? And how can the world be involved at this point? Don't wait until it's too late to see that it doesn't indeed get worse. I think there needs to be a proper realistic assessment done of how to help the situation after the regime and how to be involved
Kurt,
now
I'm going
in
to
a way
jump in
that
here.
assists
Gentlemen, we've
that,
run out of time. It would be very nice if the international community would talk to all Syrians and see what they want. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington, London, and in Cairo. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.